Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly thrilling. Something that would probably knock you right out before you reach the end of the first story. We're going to talk about a wall. Yes, one wall. Just one. And not even a very dramatic wall. No battles, no kings charging with swords, no secret passages. Just the steady, back-breaking, painfully slow construction of a single cathedral wall in medieval Europe, where time moved like molasses and people measured progress in generations instead of deadlines. So dim the lights, pull the blanket up, let your brain loosen its grip on whatever nonsense it's been juggling all day, and let's float back to the 12th century when a group of monks, masons, and tired laborers decided to build something that would take longer than most of them would be alive to finish, because of course, they did. The thing about cathedrals in medieval Europe is that nobody actually expected to see them finished. A grand cathedral was less of a construction project and more of a hereditary curse. You'd start it because the bishop wanted something impressive to show off to rival towns. And then you'd keep it going because stopping halfway would look bad. And then you'd die. Your son would die. Your grandson would die, and maybe, just maybe, the great-grandson of your neighbor's cousin would one day get to see the final stone shoved into place. But tonight, we are not even covering an entire cathedral. That would be too exciting. We are focusing on one wall, because that's really how slow this story is going to be. Let's set the scene. It's around the year 1170, give or take, somewhere in France. Because of course it's France. That's where half of Europe's most overdop cathedrals were sprouting up. The local bishop has a dream, to build a cathedral so tall and so heavy that it would immediately start sinking into the soft soil beneath it. And he wants this cathedral to have walls that stretch toward heaven, or at least higher than the church 2 towns over. So he gathers his advisors, waves his hands around dramatically, and announces, "We shall build a wall, not 4 walls, not even a tower. Just this one section first." Because everyone knew you had to start small. Now, the wall in question was not just some stack of rocks. No, this was medieval stone masonry, which meant each block had to be carved, shaped, and hoisted into place by men who had little more than wooden scaffolding and too much free time. The first step, digging a trench for the foundation, which sounds simple until you realize that medieval builders didn't exactly have precise surveying tools. So they'd dig, measure with bits of string, argue for several days about whether the trench was perfectly straight, then dig some more, and by dig, I mean peasants with shovels scraping at the earth until their backs gave out. Because let's be honest, the bishop wasn't picking up a spade. The stones themselves came from a quarry not too far away, which was convenient. If your definition of not too far is several miles and you're hauling rocks with ox carts on muddy roads, picture it, a line of sweating workers dragging limestone blocks the size of small cows, while the foreman yells at them to hurry up, as if hurrying with a 1-ton rock was an option. When the first stones finally arrived at the site, there was probably a little ceremony, maybe even a blessing, because medieval people loved blessing things. You couldn't sneeze without a priest showing up to sprinkle holy water on it. So, of course, the first stone of the wall was laid with great pomp, And the bishop probably said something about forever touching heaven. Spoiler, it touched mud. The actual building process went like this. Stone goes down, mortar goes in, wait for it to set, repeat and repeat and repeat. For weeks, the soundscape would have been hammers clinking, men grunting, maybe the occasional donkey braying in protest. And because scaffolding was basically a bunch of wooden planks lashed together with rope, every single step up the wall felt like a gamble with gravity. Now here's the funny part. Progress was so slow that people walking past the construction site would not have noticed any change. Imagine going to market every week and glancing over at the cathedral yard. 1 week, a wall is up to your waist. 6 months later, it's still at your waist. A year later, maybe it's up to your chest. Very thrilling. And of course, money was always an issue. Cathedrals ate money like medieval kings ate swans, endlessly, and with no thought to whether it was a good idea. So halfway through construction, everything would grind to a halt because the bishop had spent the treasury on fancy vestments, or maybe a holy relic that was supposed to bring in pilgrims. Pilgrims, by the way, were basically medieval tourists. They showed up, bought trinkets, and dropped coins in the donation box. The perfect side hustle for any ambitious cathedral project. But until the cash started flowing again, the workers stood around, sharpening tools, patching scaffolding, and watching their unfinished wall collect moss. Now, about the wall's design, this was Gothic architecture, which meant height, pointed arches, and the kind of overcomplicated stonework that screamed, "We're overcompensating for something." Every block had to be perfect. Every joint had to line up, or else the whole thing risked collapsing like a poorly stacked game of Jenga. And collapse they did. Not this particular wall, at least not immediately, but other walls in other cathedrals. There's a long tradition of medieval builders realizing halfway through that, oops, maybe we didn't calculate the weight correctly. And then an entire wall would tumble down after years of work. Imagine spending 20 years building one wall, only for it to crumble because some guy mismeasured by an inch. That was real life. Let's pause here and drift on a side note, because you can't talk about cathedral walls without mentioning the workforce. These were not just random peasants. Well, okay, some of them were, but the skilled labor came from stonemasons, carpenters, and artisans who actually knew what they were doing. They belonged to guilds, which were basically medieval unions with more drinking. The guilds guarded their secrets fiercely, so if you weren't born into the trade, you weren't just going to waltz in and start chiseling stone. Apprentices started young, like preteen young. Imagine being 12 years old and told, "Congratulations, you're going to spend the next 30 years learning how to carve decorative leaves onto arches. And if you're lucky, by the time you're 50, you'll be allowed to design part of a window." Meanwhile, life around the wall went on. People got married. People died of plague. Kings went to war. But the wall inched upward at a speed that would make glaciers look impatient. It's almost funny how much energy was poured into something so immobile. But that was medieval Europe for you. Everyone believed the cathedral and its walls would stand as eternal monuments. They weren't wrong. Many of those walls are still standing, long after the bishops, the masons, the guilds, and the ox carts turned to dust. All that for a wall. And so the story drifts, stone by stone, year by year. The wall climbed higher. Maybe a gargoyle was added to keep away demons, or more realistically, to serve as an elaborate drain pipe. Because medieval people loved mixing the holy with the deeply practical. The scaffolding creaked. Workers argued about wages. The bishop prayed for more donations. And the wall, patient and silent, kept growing. We're going to talk about a wall. Not even a famous wall like the Great Wall of China or Hadrian's Wall. No, just a single cathedral wall in medieval Europe. I know, it sounds like the driest thing in the world, which is exactly why it's perfect for tonight. Because you're not here for explosions or plot twists. You're here for a story that drifts forward slowly, predictably, and maybe even a little pointlessly. The kind of story where your eyelids start to droop, your breathing slows down, and before you realize it, you've lost track of whether the wall was waist-high or chest-high. So dim the lights. Sink deeper into the pillow. Let's go back almost 900 years, to a time when a bishop with more ambition than sense decided, we're going to build something big, and by big. He meant painfully slow and expensive. Cathedrals, as you probably know, were the medieval version of a civic competition. One town would say, "Our church is taller than yours." Another would reply, "Yeah, while ours has stained glass so complicated it looks like a jigsaw puzzle from hell." And then a third town would jump in, "Well, ours has flying buttresses that stick out like bony wings and scare the livestock." It was basically the Middle Ages answer to who has the tallest skyscraper. But instead of cranes and steel beams, they had donkeys and scaffolding made of whatever wood hadn't been stolen yet. Our bishop, let's call him Bishop Henry, because there's always a Bishop Henry in France, looked across the valley at a rival cathedral and decided his town deserved something even grander. And of course, he didn't start by commissioning the whole building. No, he started with a single wall, because in cathedral building, the wall is where everything begins, now. What makes this wall interesting is not that it's unique, but that it's so utterly ordinary. Thousands of medieval masons built thousands of similar walls, inch by inch, year after year. And most of those walls are still standing, stubbornly resisting gravity after all this time. So let's think about the first step, the foundation. Building a cathedral wall meant digging, and medieval digging was not glamorous. No neat little excavators, no hard hats, just peasants with shovels, picks, and a vague hope that the soil wouldn't collapse on top of them. The trench had to be deep. A cathedral wall wasn't like a farmhouse wall. It was meant to carry weight, tons and tons of stone pressing downward. So the builders dug until they hit something solid enough to serve as an anchor, often bedrock, sometimes just clay that seemed good enough. The bishop probably blessed the trench, which makes sense if you've ever tried manual labor. When you're standing knee-deep in mud, watching your boots sink with every step, you start hoping divine intervention is part of the building plan. Once the trench was dug, the stones began to arrive. Picture the quarry. Imagine half-naked workers with dust in their hair, hammering wedges into the limestone. Every strike echoes through the valley. Chips of rock fly everywhere. The air is dry and chalky, and by the end of the day, everyone's lungs feel like sandpaper. The blocks were massive. Some weighed as much as a small cow. And unlike cows, they didn't move themselves. So teams of oxen hauled them, strapped to wooden sleds or carts that broke down constantly. Every journey from quarry to cathedral was a medieval road trip from hell, complete with muddy ruts, broken wheels, and the occasional ox deciding it was done with life by the time a stone arrived. Everyone treated it with a weird sort of reverence. not because it was sacred, but because they didn't want to haul it back. And so the wall began. Stone, mortar, another stone. More mortar. Medieval mortar was a sloppy mix of lime, sand, and water. It took forever to set, which was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because you had time to adjust the stones. A curse because you had to wait days before the wall was strong enough to keep building higher. So after laying a few layers, the workers would stop. They'd pack up for the day. The mortar would dry. Then they'd come back tomorrow, climb the same rickety scaffolding, and repeat the process. And if you're thinking this sounds slow, yes, painfully slow, glacially slow, the kind of slow where you wonder if anything is happening at all. Imagine walking past the wall every Sunday for church. In January, it's knee-high. In June, maybe waist-high. By Christmas, perhaps it reaches your chest. People probably shrugged and said, well, maybe my grandchildren will see the finished thing. Now, let's drift sideways into the daily life of the masons. These men belonged to guilds, which were basically the medieval version of LinkedIn. They had secret handshakes, obscure jargon, and a lot of pride in their craft. To join, you started as an apprentice, sweeping the yard, fetching tools, and learning how to mix mortar without getting yelled at. After years of this, you graduated to journeyman. And if you were truly lucky, one day you'd be a master mason, designing whole sections of the cathedral. But for most, it was just a lifetime of carving blocks that looked exactly like the last block. Their tools were simple: wooden mallets, iron chisels, plumb lines weighted with lead, levels filled with water. If you've ever tried building IKEA furniture with one screwdriver, you know the frustration. Now imagine building a 60-foot wall with about 3 tools, none of which had been updated since the Roman Empire. Lunch breaks were not glamorous either. Bread, maybe some cheese. If it was payday, maybe salted pork. They sat on the half-built wall, chewing in silence, while bits of dust settled on their food. Hydration meant ale, not water, because water was usually full of diseases. So yes, every wall in medieval Europe was built by men who were at least mildly buzzed all day, which honestly explains a lot. Of course, nothing went smoothly. Sometimes a stone didn't fit, and they had to chisel it for hours to make it work. Sometimes the scaffolding collapsed, and a worker broke a leg. And sometimes the bishop ran out of money, and construction stopped altogether. Funding a cathedral wall was like running a modern Kickstarter campaign. You promised big rewards, eternal salvation, for example, but relied on donations that never quite matched the budget. Nobles gave money if they thought it bought them prestige. Merchants donated in hopes of tax breaks. Peasants gave because the priests said God would notice. And still, there were days when work ground to a halt because the coffers were empty. The half-built walls sat there, like an abandoned Lego project, waiting for more funds to appear. Meanwhile, life in town continued. People went to market, bought bread, argued about taxes, and ignored the wall that seemed frozen in time. Kids probably played near the scaffolding, daring each other to climb. Chickens scratched around the foundations. And every now and then, someone probably asked, "So, how long do you think this will take?" The masons, covered in dust, gave the same answer they always gave: longer than you'll be alive. And still, stone by stone, the wall rose. It grew high enough to need ladders, then scaffolding. Wooden planks, tied together with ropes, creaked under the workers' weight. tools clanged. Dust filled the air. The wall's shadow stretched longer each season, and when it finally reached its planned height, or at least the height they thought they wanted, it stood there, silent, heavy, and permanent. The bishop probably threw another blessing ceremony, maybe even a feast, because after years of labor, one wall now existed. One wall among many still to come. And then he looked at the opposite side of the cathedral yard and said, "Now let's build another one. Stone by stone, mortar by mortar, life after life spent stacking blocks into eternity. And that, my friends, is how one medieval wall was built. Slowly, tediously, expansively, but also beautifully in its own stubborn way. Because 9 centuries later, we're still talking about it. So, the wall is up. Or at least, part of it is. Not finished, of course. Never finished. But high enough that the bishop can walk past, stroke his beard, and say something like, "Yes, this is beginning to look heavenly," which was medieval bishop code for, "Please keep donating, everyone. I need more cash before the masons quit." And as the wall climbed, something else climbed with it. The scaffolding now. Scaffolding was not the neat aluminum system you see on modern construction sites. No adjustable platforms. No safety rails. Medieval scaffolding was a collection of wooden poles, tied together with rope, nailed with pegs, and prayed over by everyone who had to stand on it. Workers scrambled up planks that bent under their weight. They hauled buckets of mortar with pulleys that creaked like dying cows. And if you looked up from the street, the whole structure probably looked less like a building site and more like a giant game of pickup sticks that could collapse at any second. Accidents, of course, were common. A mason might lose his footing, drop a chisel, or discover that a rope not tied by an apprentice was not quite apprentice-worthy. And when you fell from scaffolding, there was no soft landing. The ground was stone or mud, or the nearest unlucky donkey. But here's the sleepy part. Medieval people accepted this. Falling was just part of the job. You worked high above the town square, and if you slipped, well, God's will. Some masons even carved little protective charms into the stones as they worked. Small crosses or symbols hidden inside the wall, not because they expected it to save them from falling, but because it made the endless hours of stacking rock feel a little less bleak. And then there was the question of time. You see, building a cathedral wasn't a project with a deadline. It was a project with a destiny. Nobody thought, "We'll finish in 5 years." No, they thought, "We'll finish when God lets us finish," which usually translated to, maybe in the lifetime of your great-grandchildren. This meant generations of workers were tied to the same wall. A boy might start as an apprentice carrying stones. By the time he retired, he'd carved one corner of a window. His son might add the arch above it. His grandson might finally see the wall capped with a roofline. Imagine your entire family tree dedicated to building a wall. Slowly, patiently, stone by stone. Meanwhile, the bishop had other problems. Money, always. Cathedrals ate money like medieval kings ate roasted peacocks. And the bishop's job was to squeeze coins out of everyone he could. Nobles, merchants, pilgrims, even peasants tossing coppers into a box. Every donation came with strings attached. A nobleman might say, "Here's 100 coins, but carve my family crest into the wall so everyone remembers me." A merchant might pay for a stained glass window, but only if his name was inscribed at the bottom, and peasants gave because they were told it would shorten their time in purgatory. So the wall was not just stone and mortar. It was also pride, vanity, fear, and bargaining chips with the afterlife. And here's a funny detail. Sometimes construction stopped entirely, not because of money, but because of politics. Maybe the bishop offended a local lord. Maybe the king went to war and drained the treasury. Maybe there was a famine, and people decided eating was slightly more important than finishing a wall. So there the wall stood, half-built, covered in scaffolding that rotted in the rain. Workers drifted away to other jobs. Moss grew between the stones. The whole project looked like a giant, abandoned garden planter, until years later, someone decided to start it up again. And the process repeated. Scaffolding rebuilt, stones hauled, mortar mixed, prayers mumbled. Let's float sideways for a moment and think about the weather, because the weather decided everything. In winter, mortar froze. In summer, workers collapsed from heat. Rain turned the ground into a swamp. Wind rattled the scaffolding like a child shaking a toy. Progress stopped constantly because nature had no interest in cathedral schedules. Imagine standing on a 40-foot plank while icy rain pelts your face, trying to chisel a block that keeps slipping. Imagine hauling buckets of mortar up ladders while the wind whistles so loud you can't hear the foreman's yelling. That was daily life on the wall. And when the weather was truly unbearable, the masons went to the tavern, which, honestly, was probably the safer choice. Now, let's talk tools again. Chisels dulled constantly. Hammers broke. Plumb lines frayed. Every day began with sharpening, repairing, cursing, and then sharpening again. Tools were valuable, often handed down from father to son. A mason's chisel might have worked on 3 different cathedrals in 3 different towns before ending up in this wall. And these tools weren't just functional, they were personal. Some masons carved their initials into the handles. Others left little marks on the stones themselves, tiny symbols hidden in the masonry, like medieval graffiti. You can still see some today if you look closely. So this wall, silent and heavy as it seems, was also a diary of sorts. Every chip, every mark, every faint line of mortar tells you who worked there, even if their names never made it into the bishop's records. And then, of course, there were the animals. Oxen hauling stones, horses dragging carts, donkeys carrying tools, chickens wandering around the construction yard because, apparently, chickens went everywhere in medieval towns. Cats chasing mice in the grain store, sometimes climbing onto scaffolding just to terrify everyone. You can almost picture the scene. A group of masons balancing carefully on planks, trying to haul a stone upward while a chicken pecks at the rope from below. Progress paused, again, because of poultry. It's not glamorous, but it's real. By now, the wall has reached a respectable height. The scaffolding towers above the market square. Travelers entering town see it from afar and nod politely, as if to say, "Oh, you're building something very slow and very expensive. Nice." And the bishop, he beams with pride, even though the rest of the cathedral doesn't exist yet. The wall is a promise that one day, maybe long after everyone alive has died, there will be a complete cathedral here. For now, though, it's just a wall. One wall, standing stubbornly in the middle of town, whispering, "We'll get there eventually." So, our wall exists now. Not finished, not glorious, not even particularly impressive, But it's there, standing about as tall as a stubborn fence, waiting to be noticed, and along with the wall came the scaffolding, because of course it did. The scaffolding is the unsung hero of every medieval construction site, which is funny, because it was also one of the least trustworthy things ever built. Think about this. A cathedral wall might be 30 or 40 feet high. Some went higher, and all of that stone had to be lifted, positioned, and mortared in place. There were no cranes, no forklifts, just ropes, pulleys, levers, and scaffolding that looked like it had been assembled by someone who had once seen a ladder and decided to guess the rest. The wood for scaffolding was precious. Timber wasn't cheap, and every cathedral had to fight for it. Townspeople complained that half their forests disappeared into construction projects. Local lords squabbled over who owned the good oak trees. And then, when the wood finally arrived, the carpenters lashed it together into towers of poles that creaked whenever anyone climbed them. Walking on medieval scaffolding was, let's call it, a test of faith. The planks wobbled underfoot. The ropes groaned. Nails sometimes slipped free in the wind. If you leaned too hard against the rail, assuming there even was a rail, you might find yourself plunging into the muddy street below, and still. Masons climbed up every morning, carrying their tools, buckets of mortar. And the occasional prayer now, of course. Falls happened. People did die. That's not me being grim, that's just medieval construction. A misplaced foot, a loose knot, or a sudden gust of wind, and down you went. But here's the thing, people didn't treat these accidents as shocking tragedies. They treated them as inevitable. God's will. Another body in the churchyard. The project continued. It's almost unsettling, the way life just moved on. The wall waited, the scaffolding stayed up, and new workers filled the gaps. And yet, in quiet ways, you can see that they cared. Some masons carved little crosses into hidden stones, almost like leaving behind a whisper of protection. Others scratched initials or marks, signatures no one was meant to see, except perhaps God. It was a way of saying, I was here. I worked on this wall. Don't forget me, even if I fall tomorrow. Meanwhile, the bishop was pacing. Bishops loved pacing. Every morning, he walked past the wall, trailing assistants, scribes, and perhaps a bored little dog. He inspected the stones, nodded gravely, and said things like, "Splendid progress." Gentlemen, even when the progress was so slow you'd need a calendar to measure it. But bishops had bigger problems than scaffolding. Money, mostly dot. See, cathedrals devoured money. The wall, you see, was not just stone and mortar. It was coin, debt, promises, favors, and the occasional bribe. Nobles were supposed to donate. Merchants were guilted into contributing. Peasants were encouraged to throw coppers into a collection plate with the promise that every coin shaved a few years off purgatory. Because nothing motivates donations like the fear of eternal fire. Still, no matter how many donations came in, it was never enough. The bishop's coffers drained faster than he could refill them, and so construction stuttered. Sometimes the wall rose steadily. Other times it stood frozen for months, wrapped in scaffolding like a half-finished project abandoned by an impatient child. Imagine walking through town during one of those pauses. The wall looms over the market square, unfinished. Wooden planks dangle in the wind. Moss creeps up the lower stones. Chickens peck at the mud around the foundations. Children dare each other to climb the ladders. The bishop's assistants tell everyone construction will resume soon. but no one believes them. And yet, somehow, people didn't lose faith in the wall. They knew it would be finished eventually. Not in their lifetime, maybe not even in their children's, but someday. Medieval time worked differently. People lived short, hard lives, but they thought in centuries. Now, let's talk about the masons themselves. They weren't just random workers pulled off the street. They were skilled, trained, and proud of their craft. Belonging to a mason's guild was like being part of a secret club. They had codes, symbols, rituals, and a sense of mystery about them that lasted well into later centuries. Apprentices started as boys. They carried tools, hauled buckets, and did every miserable job no one else wanted. After years of back-breaking labor, they learned to cut stone properly, to read the patterns, to measure with strings and plumb lines. By the time they became journeymen, their hands were scarred, their backs bent, and their patience worn thin. And the masters, they were almost like rock stars. Not the flashy kind, no screaming fans, just quiet respect. If you were a master mason, you might design a vault, a doorway, or even part of the wall itself, and your name would be remembered, maybe even carved into a hidden stone for future generations to wonder about. So when you look at this wall, you're not just seeing stone, you're seeing the life's work of dozens of men, each leaving tiny fingerprints in history. Of course, let's not forget the animals. Oxen dragged the stones from the quarry. Horses hauled timber. Donkeys carried loads of mortar. And, inevitably, chickens wandered everywhere because chickens had no sense of boundaries. I like to imagine some mason, 20 feet up on scaffolding, trying to balance a bucket of mortar, when a goat wanders onto the ropes below and starts chewing, because goats absolutely would. It's the little interruptions that made cathedral building even slower than it already was. And then there was the weather. Rain soaked the scaffolding until it sagged like wet laundry. Frost cracked stones before they were even set. Wind howled through the planks, shaking everything. And in summer, the sun baked the masons until they were half delirious, swinging chisels in slow motion. Sometimes work stopped for whole seasons. A harsh winter could delay construction until spring thawed the mortar. A storm could collapse weeks of progress in one night. And everyone just shrugged and started over, because the wall wasn't in a hurry. The wall didn't care about weather or hunger or money. The wall just waited. By now, maybe you can picture it. A town square, a bishop pacing, masons climbing, oxen pulling, scaffolding creaking, and, at the center, a wall that inched upward with all the urgency of a snail. Every block laid was a triumph. Every accident was forgotten. Every delay was shrugged at. And still, the wall grew, not quickly, not smoothly, but inevitably. If you stand close to the cathedral wall, closer than you're really supposed to, you'll notice something. The stones aren't smooth. They aren't perfect. They don't line up with the mathematical precision of modern bricks. Each block is just a little uneven. Each corner a little softer than geometry would prefer. That's because every stone had to be shaped by hand. The tools of a slow craft. Masons had a small collection of tools, none of them complicated, but each one essential. First, the hammer and chisel. They came in different sizes, of course, for different tasks. A broad chisel could shave off big chunks of limestone in a satisfying, dusty spray. A narrow one could cut delicate grooves or smooth a stubborn edge. And the hammer, just a block of iron on a wooden handle. struck again and again, thousands of times in a day, until the mason's arm felt like part of the rhythm itself. Then there was the mallet, often made of hard wood for gentler taps, and the square, a simple L-shaped tool of iron or wood to check that corners were true. The plumb line, a string with a weight on the end, was the ancient way to know if a wall was leaning, and it still worked perfectly. You can picture it, a mason crouched on the scaffolding, squinting along a plumb line swaying in the breeze, muttering under his breath that the wall looked straighter yesterday. There were also compasses, dividers, and levels, most of them looking like props from a geometry lesson. They weren't flashy, they weren't fast, but they worked, slowly, and that was the point. Cathedral building was never about speed, the weight of stone now. Let's think about the stones themselves. They came from quarries, sometimes nearby, sometimes miles away. Oxen dragged them in carts. Boats carried them on rivers when the bishop was lucky enough to have one nearby. Each block was heavy, awkward, and uncooperative. A single stone might weigh more than the man shaping it. Moving it required ropes, wooden rollers, ramps, and a kind of patience modern builders might not even recognize. And when the block finally arrived at the wall, it wasn't ready to use. It had to be trimmed, squared, and fitted. That meant hours of tapping, shaving, adjusting, until the stone settled into its place as if it had always belonged there. Imagine the sound of it, the steady tink, tink, tink of iron on limestone. Not loud, not urgent, just rhythmic, like rain on a roof, or a clock that doesn't really care what time it is. The rhythm of work the day of a mason was measured less by hours and more by repetition. The morning began with hauling, stones to the scaffolding, mortar to the buckets, water drawn from wells, tools sharpened. Then, slowly, deliberately, each mason took his place and began the endless dance of chisel and hammer, dot, tap, shift, tap again. Blow away dust, step back, squint at the line, adjust, tap again. It was slow enough to drive some men mad, but for others it became almost meditative. You can imagine the older masons falling into the rhythm like monks into prayer, the wall rising inch by inch while their thoughts wandered to everything and nothing. Around them, apprentices scrambled. They fetched stones, mixed mortar, held ladders, and tried not to drop anything important. Apprentices were expected to watch and learn, but mostly they just sweated and carried things. Every master remembered being in their shoes, and every apprentice dreamed of the day he'd be trusted to shape his first real stone. Little problems, big delays now. Here's the thing about stone. It doesn't always cooperate. Sometimes a block cracked in the wrong place. Sometimes the quarry sent pieces that were too soft or too brittle. Sometimes, halfway through shaping a block, the mason would realize it was flawed beyond use. Days of work wasted, tossed aside into a growing pile of rejected rubble. And then there was mortar. Medieval mortar was a blend of lime, sand, and water, mixed by hand in wooden tubs. Get the proportions wrong, and the wall might crumble in a few years. Let it dry too fast, and it turned weak and powdery. Mixed a little, and work stopped until more was ready. So every stone placed into the wall was not just an act of strength. It was an act of patience, of watching and waiting, hoping the materials behaved. A soundtrack of the Middle Ages if you could time travel to that construction site. Not the glamorous stained glass part, but right here, at the wall. You'd notice the sound first, not music, not singing, just work, the clink of chisels, the thud of hammers, the creak of ropes, the grunt of oxen, the muttered curses of apprentices hauling too much at once, and in the background, the everyday noise of a medieval town, a woman selling bread in the square, a cart rolling by, a dog barking at nothing, the faint toll of a church bell marking a time no one really followed, all of it blending together into a kind of accidental symphony of slowness. The marks left behind one of the strangest, most human details of cathedral walls are the little marks left by masons. Many stones bear tiny symbols, chisels scratched into corners, initials, little geometric signs. These weren't decoration. They were signatures, ways of saying, "This block is mine. I shaped it." Sometimes these marks were practical. Masons were often paid by the stone, not by the hour, so they needed proof of their work. But over time, the marks became something more, almost like graffiti. Quiet whispers of individuality in a project so huge it often erased the people who built it. You can still see some of these marks today, if you know where to look, hidden on the undersides of arches, or in the shadows of towers. Centuries later, they remain tiny reminders of hands that held tools, of men who climbed scaffolding, of workers whose names never made it into history books. And so, the wall rose. Not quickly, not smoothly, but steadily. Each block shaped by tools that dulled too fast. Each block lifted by ropes that creaked too much. Each block fitted by hands that ached too soon. The wall did not care. The walls simply grew, patient and heavy, while generations of masons passed beneath its shadow. The scaffolding that held it. Aleph, you imagine a cathedral wall. You have to imagine scaffolding too, because without it, the whole thing would have stopped at about shoulder height. Medieval scaffolding was, let's say, minimalist. Basically, long wooden poles lashed together, lashed again when they started creaking, and trusted far more than they deserved. Boards were laid across, wide enough for a man to stand with a bucket. Not much more, no railings, no harnesses, no safety nets. You just climbed up, carried your hammer, and hoped you didn't look down. Apprentices especially were sent up and down all day, sometimes barefoot, because boots slipped more easily on wood, sometimes in the rain, when the boards grew slick and unforgiving, and yet, somehow, most of the time, it worked. The scaffolding went up as the wall went up, tier by tier, until the whole thing looked like a spider's web clinging to stone. And when you stood on it, you didn't just see the wall. You saw the whole town below. Chimneys smoking, chickens darting between houses, market stalls, and of course, a crowd of onlookers who never tired of gawking at the cathedral that was growing in their backyard. Whether the real master builder, if the tools were simple and the scaffolding sketchy, the weather was the real boss of construction. Rain could shut everything down. Mortar refused to set if it was soaked. Stones grew slippery and dangerous to handle. Wooden scaffolding swelled and groaned. Winter froze work completely. The lime in the mortar wouldn't cure in cold. Water turned to ice, splitting stones apart. Masons might still gather, still chip at small blocks in the workshops. But the wall itself simply waited until spring, summer brought its own problems. Heat dried mortar too fast, leaving it brittle. Men sweated through their tunics. Dust filled their throats until every cough sounded like gravel rattling in a jar. The truth is, The wall wasn't built on man's schedule. It was built on the schedule of clouds and seasons. Work happened when the sky allowed and paused when it didn't, which meant, of course, more delays, more time, more patience, accidents, falls, and shrugs. Now you might be wondering, what about accidents? Yes, they happened. Stones slipped from ropes, buckets tipped over, scaffolding gave way, a misstep, a loose knot, a distracted glance, and someone might find himself falling faster than prayers could catch him. But here's the thing. Medieval building sites didn't have safety regulations. There was no committee, no inspection officer, no paperwork. If a man fell, there was grief, maybe a brief pause, and then work resumed. For the masons, this was just part of life. Dangerous, yes, but also normal. After all, farming was dangerous too. So was traveling on roads full of bandits, or living in towns where plague visited like an old friend in the quiet rhythm of building. Death didn't stop the wall. It simply slowed it briefly. And then the tapping of chisels resumed. Apprentices and the long waiting gamelet. Let's talk more about the apprentices. They were usually young, sometimes barely teenagers, sent by families hoping their boy would earn a respectable trade. Respectable meaning he wouldn't starve, he wouldn't be a beggar, and he wouldn't be entirely useless to society. Apprenticeships lasted years. During that time, the apprentice mixed mortar, carried stones, sharpened chisels, fetched water, and listened. Mostly listened. The masters didn't explain much. If you wanted to learn, you watched carefully and copied quietly. And if you were lucky, very lucky, after several years of fetching and carrying, you might be trusted with carving your own small stone. Not a gargoyle. Not a statue. Just a block. A block that would slide invisibly into the wall. For an apprentice, that block was like a diploma, proof that he was on the path. Proof that one day, maybe, his hands would shape arches that people actually noticed. Until then, he kept climbing ladders and biting. Back curses when mortar sloshed onto his tunic. The master masons and their plans above, the apprentices and the ordinary masons stood the master. Mason, he wasn't just the best carver. He was the architect, the project manager, the mathematician, and sometimes the politician. It was the master mason who held the parchment plans, drawn in careful ink, covered in measurements that didn't always match reality. He was the one pacing the scaffolding, squinting up at angles, muttering to himself about how the bishop wanted this wall higher, or how the chapter house was complaining about the budget again. He had authority, but not freedom. Every decision was checked against the bishop, who checked against the cathedral chapter, who sometimes checked against whoever was paying the bills. So yes, the master mason could dream up a grand facade, but if money dried up, or if a war broke out, or if the bishop suddenly decided that gold leaf on the altar was more important than, say, keeping rain out of the nave, the wall waited and waited, building by inches. The effect of all this was a kind of slowness modern people can hardly imagine. A modern office building might rise in a year, a skyscraper in 2 or 3, but a medieval cathedral wall, it could take decades, generations, sometimes centuries. Think of it this way. A boy might start his apprenticeship carrying stones for the lower courses of the wall. By the time he was a grey-haired master, that same wall might still be climbing, still unfinished, its top lost in scaffolding. Whole lives were lived in the shadow of an unfinished project, and no one found this strange. No one said, "Why is this taking so long?" They knew it would. That was the rhythm of stone. The wall as a kind of calendar in a way. The wall became a calendar of human life. Children were born, grew up, and married while the wall slowly rose. Old men died and were buried, sometimes in the shadow of the very building they had helped construct. Every course of stone told not just the story of construction, but of time itself passing in a community. The cathedral wasn't just a building project. It was a background to everything else. And maybe that's why people accepted the delays. The wall wasn't meant to be finished quickly. It was meant to stand for centuries, to outlast its builders, to remind everyone who walked past that patience and stone had a different clock than flesh and blood. So, as the hammers tapped, as chisels sang their quiet, metallic songs, the wall grew taller. It crept upward through rain and frost, through years when money flowed and years when it didn't. Always slow, always heavy, always waiting. The masons kept working. The apprentices kept climbing. The master mason kept pacing with his plumb line. And the wall, indifferent to all of them, simply kept becoming itself. A cathedral as public entertainment. When we imagine medieval life, we sometimes forget how little there was to do. No movies, no football matches, no TikTok, not even a mildly funny pamphlet unless you happened to be literate, which most weren't. So what did people do for entertainment? They watched the war. Seriously, a cathedral construction site was like a long-running theatre performance, except the plot never advanced and the actors were mostly tired men covered in dust. Townsfolk came to see the scaffolding grow taller, to point at new carvings, to argue over whether the bishop had enough money to finish the nave. Children darted under carts, chasing chickens, while their parents craned their necks to watch a block of stone creak slowly upward on ropes. Each stone was a spectacle, because each stone was expensive. People gasped when something cracked. They murmured when the mortar looked sloppy. They clapped, sometimes, when a dangerous piece was set in place without killing anyone. It wasn't Netflix. But it passed the time, the gossip of progressand, of course. The wall became a source of endless gossip. The baker's wife insisted she knew a mason who swore the tower would lean. The butcher claimed the bishop was skimming money from the project, though he still donated meat for feast days. Old men in taverns argued over whether the cathedral would ever be finished in their lifetimes. Spoiler, it probably wouldn't. Every addition sparked rumors. A new arch. Clearly a sign that funds had arrived from a noble donor. A pause in construction. Proof that God was angry at the bishop, or that the masons were lazy, or both. Even the shape of the windows gave rise to speculation. Too tall, said some. Too narrow, said others. Clearly the master mason had no idea what he was doing, muttered another, before ordering another ale. The wall wasn't just a wall. It was a community mirror, reflecting every anxiety, every boast, every scrap of town chatter. The bishop's point of view for the bishop, however, the wall wasn't entertainment. It was politics. A cathedral wasn't just a church. It was a billboard of power. A taller wall meant a taller reputation. Bigger windows meant a bigger statement. Every stone laid into place was meant to remind everyone, peasants, nobles, even rival bishops, that God had clearly chosen this town as a beacon of holiness. So the bishop visited the site often. He probably swept in with attendants, robes swishing through dust, pretending not to notice the smell of sweat. He nodded gravely offered a blessing, and then quietly asked the master mason why progress seemed so slow and whether it might be possible to make the wall look more impressive. And the master mason, tired of explaining gravity for the 100th time, probably said something polite like, "Yes, my lord. But stone takes time." The bishop left dissatisfied, because bishops always left dissatisfied. But at least he could assure visiting nobles that work was proceeding nicely. Feast days and holy interruptions, of course. Even when the weather was good and the masons were willing, and the scaffolding hadn't collapsed. There was another obstacle. The church calendar. Medieval Europe was filled with feast days. Holy days, fast days, saints' days, vigils, and the occasional inexplicable day off. On those days, work stopped. Tools were put away. Stones sat where they were instead. The townsfolk flocked to processions. Priests sang chants, and masons, who weren't saints themselves, joined the crowd, half out of devotion and half because, well, it was nice not to lift anything for once. And so the wall paused, again. If you added up all the time lost to feast days, it's no wonder cathedral walls took centuries. God may have wanted the building, but he also demanded a schedule that guaranteed slow progress. Markets around the scaffolding where there are people. There are markets, and cathedral construction sites quickly attracted sellers. Food stalls appeared nearby, meat pies, bread, ale. Tool vendors hawked chisels and nails. Children darted through with trays of apples. The site became part building yard, part fairground, and the masons, dusty and tired, probably resented this circus. Imagine spending your day sweating over a block of stone, only to hear some hawker yelling about roasted chestnuts right beneath your ladder. Still, those chestnuts smelled good. Apprentices snuck down with coins in their pockets. Masters grumbled, but bought ale anyway. Even the bishop's attendants, hovering like nervous geese, sometimes slipped into the crowd to buy sweet pastries. The wall wasn't built in silence. It was built in the middle of a noisy, bustling, hungry town, pilgrims, and the idea of fame. And then there were the pilgrims. Word spread quickly that this cathedral was rising, and that relics, real or suspiciously acquired, would one day rest inside. Pilgrims arrived early, hoping to be part of history. They shuffled around the scaffolding, craned their necks, whispered prayers at half-finished arches. For them, the wall was already holy, even if the rain still leaked through it. To touch the stone was to brush against eternity, and to gossip back home about what they'd seen was even better. The bishop encouraged this, of course. Pilgrims meant donations. Donations meant more stone. More stone meant more prestige. And so, the cycle continued. The cathedral as a community burden. Not everyone loved the wall, though some townsfolk grumbled about the endless taxes levied to fund it. Others muttered about their labor being conscripted. Farmers cursed when their oxen were borrowed for hauling stone, instead of plowing fields. And there was always the quiet question, wouldn't the town be better off with new mills, new roads, new wells, instead of this towering monument that swallowed money like a bottomless pit? But no one dared say it too loudly. The cathedral wasn't just a building, it was God's house. And to criticize the wall was to risk criticizing God himself. Most people decided it was safer to just shrug, complain quietly, and keep paying. So the wall rose, not just from stone and mortar, but from the attention of the town. From gossip, feasts, markets, prayers, curses, donations, and size. It wasn't just the masons who built it. It was the entire community, whether they liked it or not. And slowly, always slowly, the wall became not just part of the cathedral, but part of the town's story, a heavy, patient backdrop to every life lived in its shadow. Noble donors and their odd demands, of course. A cathedral wall doesn't rise on stone and sweat alone. You need money, lots of it. And in medieval Europe, that money usually came from nobles. But nobles are particular. They never just give money. They want something in return, often something completely impractical. A duke might donate a hefty sum, but only if his coat of arms is carved somewhere visible. A baroness might insist on her favorite saint's likeness in a window, even if the window is not quite ready for glass yet. And every so often, a noble would request that a section of wall be made taller, just to make his house across town look less small. The master mason and the bishop had to accommodate these whims because, frankly, a noble's purse was worth more than logic. Every stone, every arch, every carving could become a bargaining chip. So the wall was not only a building project, it was a negotiation. A slow, dusty negotiation stretched over decades. Seasonal pauses and the long wait weave mentioned the weather before, but it's worth dwelling on again. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was absolute. Winter might freeze mortar solid. Spring rains could turn the yard into a mud pit. Summer heat baked workers until they moved like slow shadows. Autumn winds tore ropes and toppled scaffolding. On bad weather days, work stopped entirely. Masons retreated to workshops to carve smaller stones. Apprentices fetched firewood, and everyone tried to stay warm. The wall just waited. Stone after stone, mortar after mortar, paused indefinitely until the sky approved of progress. Sometimes months would go by without anything noticeable happening. The townsfolk would gossip about it. Surely they've abandoned the project, someone would mutter. But the wall had no opinion. It simply remained, tall and patient. Superstitions and rituals. The people building the wall had their own ways of coping with all this slowness. Some carved little symbols into hidden stones, meant to ward off evil spirits. Others whispered prayers before laying each block. A few carried tiny charms in their pockets, believing they might prevent accidents, or at least prevent scaffolding from collapsing. Apprentices were often required to touch a particular stone before starting their day, or they were considered unlucky. Masters sometimes tapped the wall 3 times with a chisel before adding a new block, just in case. No one really knew whether it worked, and no one really cared. It was part of the rhythm, part of the routine that made endless, repetitive labor feel a little safer. Generational work by now. It's easy to imagine that this wall was older than some of its workers. And it was. A boy might begin as an apprentice carrying stones for the lower levels. By the time he reached middle age, he could be shaping arches 20 feet higher. By the time he grew old and grey, the scaffolding might have risen another 20 feet, and the wall still wouldn't be complete. Sometimes sons took over from fathers. Sometimes grandsons worked on the same block their grandfather had shaped. Every layer of stone carried a faint echo of the hands that had touched it before. And so the wall became more than a building. It became a living memory of generations, a slow-moving monument to time itself. The bishop and church politics, meanwhile, the bishop continued to pace. Bishops love pacing. He had to answer to the cathedral chapter, a committee of clerics, who loved nothing more than pointing out flaws and questioning every penny spent. He had to keep the townsfolk from revolting at taxes. He had to satisfy nobles with enough prominence in the carvings to make them feel important. And, of course, he had to keep God happy. Every day was a balancing act. A wall that was too plain made him seem stingy. A wall too ornate emptied his treasury. A pause in construction risked murmurs of incompetence. The bishop didn't solve all these problems. He shuffled papers, nodded gravely, muttered prayers, and hoped the wall would just behave. Mostly it did. Because the wall doesn't argue. The economy around the wall, life around the wall wasn't just stone and labor. It was also commerce. Local markets flourished. Bakers, butchers, ale sellers, toolmakers, and blacksmiths all benefited from the constant activity. Pilgrims brought extra coin into town. Farmers sold food to the workers. Merchants hawked ropes, pulleys, and nails. Even peasants who weren't directly involved in construction felt the impact. Roads got trampled by oxen carts. Fields were sometimes requisitioned for timber or stone storage. Life slowed down or sped up depending on the rhythm of construction. The wall wasn't just a building. It was a small economic universe, slowly evolving over decades. Watching, waiting. And the quiet of the wall, perhaps the most curious thing about a cathedral wall, is how patient it is. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't complain. It doesn't make noise. It just waits. Generations of people watched it grow. They argued, prayed, donated, cursed, and slept under its shadow. Children were born. Apprentices grew into masters. Old men passed away, and the wall continued to rise, as slow as sediment in a river, as patient as a cat waiting for the sun. Even today, when you walk past a half-finished cathedral, you can sense it. You can almost hear the echo of chisels and hammers, the murmur of townsfolk gossiping, the distant prayers of a bishop pacing. It's a reminder that history doesn't always move quickly. Sometimes it just waits, like a stone being shaped by careful hands over decades, even centuries. Pulley problems, one of the slowest and most nerve-wracking aspects of wall building, was the pulley system. Ropes looped through wheels, lifting stones up to scaffolding. Simple in theory, fraught with peril in practice. If a rope frayed, a stone dropped, and the masons had to scramble to prevent a disaster. Sometimes a bucket of mortar swung sideways, smacking a poor apprentice in the back. Sometimes the pulley itself jammed, leaving a massive block dangling in midair for hours, until someone climbed up to wiggle it loose. Pulley mishaps were mostly minor. Sometimes they caused bruises, sometimes spilt mortar, sometimes a very loud clatter that drew a small crowd of gawking townsfolk. And yet, life moved on. The wall didn't flinch. The pulley was fixed. The stone was hoisted again. Watching pulleys fail became part of the town's entertainment. People whispered, "There goes another stone," free-falling like God intended, and then shrugged, because the medieval town was patient. Masons' rivalries despite the slow pace of construction. Tension simmered among masons. Some were proud of their work. Some were lazy. Some thought they were masters when they were really just journeymen with a loud voice. There were arguments over whose chisel mark looked better, whose stone was straighter, whose mortar mix was superior. Masters occasionally whispered rumors to the bishop, claiming another mason had cut corners. Apprentices learned quickly to stay out of these debates, carrying stones quietly and avoiding eye contact. The rivalry slowed work slightly, but they also kept everyone on their toes. Pride was one of the few motivators strong enough to counteract centuries of waiting. Feast. Day interruptions. Feast days continued to break the rhythm of work. Every Saint's Day meant a pause. Workers went to Mass. Townsfolk came to the square. Markets emptied, except for sellers of candles and incense. Some masons used these days for quiet carving indoors, but often the work simply stopped. And because feast days weren't evenly spaced, months could pass with multiple interruptions, leaving scaffolding dangling above partially set stones. The wall. Indifferent, weighted. Minor political scandals, even in a small town. Political drama crept into the wall's shadow. A noble might accuse the bishop of misusing funds. A wealthy merchant might complain that donations weren't being used as promised. The cathedral chapter sometimes quarreled internally over which part of the wall deserved attention. These disputes didn't usually stop construction entirely. At most, payments were delayed, scaffolding temporarily removed, or a master mason quietly threatened with reassignment. But the townsfolk enjoyed the gossip. Nothing as exciting as a battle. But the slow intrigue of petty politics added a layer of human interest to the creeping rhythm of stone. Pilgrims and curiosity pilgrims were still a constant presence. Some came from distant towns, traveling days to touch a stone or see progress on the wall. Others arrived simply to gawk and speculate. Pilgrims brought coins, sometimes gifts, sometimes just their curiosity. Occasionally, a pilgrim would try to help, climbing, scaffolding, or attempting to haul a stone. This ended badly. Apprentices would shoo them away, the masters would sigh, and the wall would remain unchanged except for a dent in a bucket or a frayed rope. Even so, the presence of outsiders reminded everyone that the wall was meant to impress beyond the town. Its story reached further than mud streets and timbered houses. Generational perspective continued now. Let's revisit the generational effect by this stage. Several generations had watched the wall grow. A mason might begin as a boy lifting stones, grow into a master shaping arches, and still not see the top completed in his lifetime. Apprentices of that generation might one day teach the next, and the work would continue. Parents whispered stories of their ancestors who had labored on the lower courses. Children learned that some stones were shaped by hands long gone, and the wall became more than stone. It was history in 3 dimensions, each layer a story, a memory, a patient witness to human life. Small mishaps in daily life, almost forgettable events also shaped the rhythm of the wall. A ladder slipping slightly, forcing a mason to reposition. A sudden downpour soaking the mortar. Chickens wandering onto the scaffolding. A donkey tipping a bucket. Little things that, taken together, slowed progress endlessly. But these events also made life interesting, in the quiet way that medieval towns found entertaining. Children ran races around piles of stone. Apprentices told exaggerated stories of near misses. Masters grumbled while secretly chuckling, even in monotony. There were tiny narratives unfolding daily. Food and drink. Masons and apprentices needed fuel. Meals were simple. Bread, cheese, stews, occasional meat. Water from wells. Ale when possible. Sometimes the bishop or a noble donated a feast to encourage morale. Food breaks marked the rhythm of the day almost as much as the chisel did. Workers sat on stones, leaned on scaffolding, swapped stories, and rested aching limbs before returning to the slow, deliberate work. The wall as a witness. The final thought about the wall is this: it was a patient witness. It saw generations live and die. It endured feasts, famine, rain, frost, gossip, politics, pilgrimages, rivalries, and accidents. It absorbed centuries of human activity without complaint. The masons climbed, fell, and climbed again. The apprentices grew up. The town argued. The bishop paced. The nobles met, and the wall simply remained, creeping upward, waiting to be finished. Whenever that might be. It's a reminder, perhaps, that history isn't always about dramatic battles or sudden upheavals. Sometimes it's about slow persistence, about people, animals, weather, and politics interacting in ways so gradual they almost feel invisible. And that is exactly what makes watching a cathedral wall grow such a perfect story for a sleepy mind. The masons' daily grind by this stage. The masons had settled into a rhythm that might seem painfully slow to modern eyes. They arrived early, usually before the sun had fully risen. The air smelled of dew, wet earth, and stone dust. Tools were laid out on the boards, sharpened and inspected. Apprentices fetched buckets of water and mortar, keeping quiet lest they be scolded for clumsiness. The masters squinted at the wall, tapping chisels and occasionally muttering measurements. They judged each stone carefully, checking angles, inspecting surfaces, ensuring that every block fit just so. One misalignment could throw off a course, or worse, force hours of rework. The rhythm was methodical. Lift, set, chisel, tap, step back, squint, adjust, repeat, 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 and so the wall grew. Imperceptibly, mistakes and minor mishaps, no matter how skilled. Mistakes were inevitable. Sometimes a stone split the wrong way. A hammer slipped. A pulley jammed. Mortar cracked in the sun. Even the best masons occasionally cursed silently, frustrated that a small error could undo hours of work. And yet, the wall remained patient. It didn't hurry, didn't scold, didn't notice. It simply awaited correction. Apprentices were especially prone to mistakes. A bucket of mortar spilled, a stone tipped, a rope frayed. Masters scolded. Apprentices learned. Days passed. The work continued. All of it was slow, repetitive, and strangely calming if you allowed your mind to settle into the rhythm. The apprentices. Prospective apprentices often spent years performing menial tasks, carrying stones, hauling water, sweeping dust, sharpening chisels, and avoiding the ire of the masters. But slowly, over time, they began to notice patterns. They learned the subtle differences in stone texture. They began to anticipate the quirks of the mortar. They understood the weight of a pulley, the sway of scaffolding, and the delicate balance between a hammer's strength and a stone's resilience. By the end of their apprenticeship, these young men had internalized decades of accumulated knowledge, and yet the wall would likely still be unfinished. Patience became not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Town life around the wall life. In the town continued around the slow rise of the cathedral wall. Children played in the shadows, shouting and chasing each other across uneven streets. Markets buzzed with activity. Bakers sold bread, butchers carved meat. Ale sellers shouted over the clamor. Pilgrims arrived, curious about progress and eager to glimpse the sacred work. The wall itself became a backdrop to daily life. It framed conversations, feasts, arguments, and quiet contemplations alike. Its mere presence imposed a sense of order and continuity in an otherwise unpredictable world. Food and rest masons needed sustenance. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, occasional meat, and water or ale. Food breaks were sacred moments of rest, a chance to sit on a stone, wipe sweat from brows, and share gossip or complaints. Sleep was often short. Masons lived in small houses or dormitories, sometimes near the cathedral, sometimes in temporary shelters. Exhaustion was part of life, but so was routine, even when work paused, because of weather, feast days, or pulley mishaps. The rhythm of meals, tools, and scaffolding kept the day structured. Minor accidents and daily humor, small accidents happened constantly. A stone might slip from a scaffold. A bucket might tip. An apprentice might trip over a rope. The masters might sigh and mutter under their breath. Townsfolk would glance up, gasp, and then continue with their day, even in danger. There was a peculiar humor to life at the wall. Missteps were inevitable, and almost everyone learned to shrug and keep going. It was a slow comedy of errors, never violent, never dramatic, perfectly suited to a sleepy mind listening long into the evening. Generations in motion by now. Multiple generations of masons might be working on the same section of wall. Apprentices of one era became masters of the next. Sons replaced fathers. Brothers replaced brothers. The wall became a silent chronicle of time, a testament to human patience and persistence. Each stone carried the mark of hands long gone, yet remained functional, enduring. And patient people passing by would see only stone. But anyone who worked there knew the truth. The wall was alive with memory. Every hammer tap, every chisel scratch, every smudge of mortar was recorded, invisible but present. Pilgrims, nobles, and visitors, the presence of outsiders continued to shape the rhythm of the site. Pilgrims arrived to touch stone, pray, or simply gawk. Nobles arrived to inspect progress, add funds, or demand special carvings. Visitors disrupted the rhythm slightly, but they also reinforced the cathedral's importance. Their presence reminded the masons, apprentices, and townsfolk that this wall was part of something larger, something sacred, enduring, and far-reaching. Even casual curiosity became a driver of patience, because the wall's audience was endless, spanning generations, towns, and regions. The wall as a lesson in patience ultimately. Life in the shadow of the wall was a lesson in slow, deliberate persistence. There were no shortcuts. There were mistakes, mishaps, rivalries, interruptions, and delays. There were weather events, feast days, and curious outsiders. And yet, the wall grew, stone by stone, slowly, predictably. Quietly, it taught everyone involved a lesson that modern life often forgets. Progress can be imperceptible, repetitive, frustrating, and still meaningful. Sometimes the most important work is the work that waits, that endures, that demands patience above all else. Emotional toll on the masons even, though the work was methodical and repetitive. It carried an emotional weight. Masons often woke before sunrise, muscles already sore from years of hauling, lifting, and chiseling. Their hands were calloused, fingers stiff from constant hammering. Some complained quietly to apprentices. Others simply muttered to themselves, tracing a finger over the uneven lines of stone, wishing it would cooperate more readily. Mistakes were humbling. A block split the wrong way. A chisel slipped, mortar dried too quickly. Hours, sometimes days of effort, could vanish in a single miscalculation. Masters scolded, apprentices feared punishment, and the wall remained indifferent. Yet, amidst frustration, there was pride. Even imperfect stones were part of something greater than the individuals shaping them. Each placement contributed to the slow ascent of the wall, a wall that might outlast them all. Seasonal rhythms and work cycles life, and work were dictated by the seasons. Winter froze mortar and stone alike. Masons retreated indoors, carving smaller blocks or repairing tools. Apprentices gathered firewood or tended forges. Work paused, but the rhythm of preparation continued. Spring brought rain, softening the earth, turning the yard into a muddy canvas. Stones were slippery, scaffolding slick. Work resumed cautiously, every step measured, every block set with extra attention. Summer was hot and exhausting. Sweat ran into eyes, dust filled throats, but sunlight allowed for longer workdays. Masons pushed forward, but fatigue set in quickly. Autumn brought cooler winds and intermittent rain. It was unpredictable, so work continued only when conditions allowed. This constant adaptation to nature slowed the wall's ascent, forcing patience on everyone involved. Through these cycles, the wall became more than stone. It became a silent witness to the passage of time, marking seasons as clearly as any calendar. Town festivals and public life, the town didn't stop for the wall. Festivals and public gatherings were frequent. Feast days were celebrations, music, dancing, food, and games. Masons sometimes attended, though reluctantly, returning to work tired and dusty. Apprentices loved them, sneaking extra treats, gossiping with townsfolk, and watching performances in the shadow of scaffolding. Markets thrived during festivals. Merchants brought exotic goods, pilgrims arrived, nobles made appearances. The wall stood as a backdrop to it all, indifferent yet central, quietly imposing itself into every corner of town life. Even mundane events, like a donkey tipping over a basket of apples, became small stories repeated in whispers, then laughter, then forgotten, all against the constant presence of stone. Minor accidents and everyday drama life around the wall was slow, but not without incidents. Ropes frayed, stones slipped, scaffolding creaked. Apprentices dropped tools, spilling buckets of mortar. Occasionally, a small stone would fall, narrowly missing someone below. Masters sighed and adjusted. Town gossiped. Life continued. These tiny disruptions created a subtle rhythm. The masons adapted. Apprentices learned. Townsfolk watched. And the wall simply waited, continuing to grow. Patient and indifferent. Even the smallest mishaps reminded everyone of the precarious nature of building something so large, so permanent, yet so fragile in its process. The apprentices' journey by now. Apprentices had grown accustomed to the slow pace. They observed patterns. They learned how stones settled over time, how mortar reacted to sun and rain, how scaffolding behaved under weight. They became adept at anticipating problems before they happened. Years passed, and apprentices matured into journeymen. Some eventually became masters themselves, yet the wall remained unfinished. The process stretched across decades, teaching the value of persistence, patience, and careful observation. It was as much a lesson in life as it was in construction. Pilgrims and visitors, Quiet observers, pilgrims, continued to arrive. Some came to touch the stone, others to pray, others to simply marvel. They whispered prayers, offered coins, or left small tokens behind. Nobles visited periodically, inspecting progress, giving donations, or making minor demands for special carvings. Visitors disrupted the rhythm slightly, but they also reinforced the cathedral's importance. Their presence reminded the masons, apprentices, and townsfolk that this wall was part of a larger story. A story of faith, patience, and human endeavor. The wall bore witness to it all, unmoved, unhurried, continuing its slow, patient ascent, small triumphs despite the endless patience required. Small successes brought satisfaction. A difficult stone finally fit perfectly. A pulley system worked without incident for the entire day. Mortar set just right. Scaffolding held firm in high winds. These small victories were celebrated quietly. Masters nodded, apprentices beamed, townsfolk whispered approval. And then the rhythm resumed. Lift, set, chisel, tap, step back, squint, adjust. Each tiny triumph reinforced the value of persistence. It reminded everyone that progress was cumulative, slow, and steady, even when imperceptible to the casual observer. Reflection, the wall as teacher ultimately. Life in the shadow of the wall was an exercise in endurance, patience, humility, attention to detail, and persistence were required of everyone, masters, apprentices, townsfolk, and visitors alike. The wall didn't rush. It didn't reward impatience. It simply existed, growing slowly, inevitably, and persistently. And in doing so, it taught those around it lessons that no sermon or lecture could convey. Time moved differently here. Days and years were measured not by clocks, but by stone, mortar, and the patient rhythm of hands at work. The wall was a quiet teacher, a slow chronicle of human life, a monument to persistence. And for those who lived in its shadow, it shaped not just the town, but the very way they experienced time. The slow evolution of planned cathedral construction rarely followed the original blueprint perfectly. Master masons drew detailed plans, often on parchment, showing exact placement of arches, windows, and buttresses. But as construction proceeded, realities intervened. Stones didn't always fit as expected. Foundations settled unevenly. Nobles requested changes. Bishops demanded bigger, taller, more impressive features. Plans were adjusted constantly, sometimes in minor ways. An arch slightly taller here, a carving shifted there. Other times, major redesigns occurred. A window added, a tower expanded, an entire section reordered. These adjustments slowed the work, but also ensured that each wall, each arch, each tower reflected decades of accumulated knowledge, taste, and negotiation. Funding struggles, money was a constant challenge. The cathedral relied on donations from nobles, merchants, and townsfolk. Pilgrims contributed coins and gifts, but funds were never guaranteed, and delays often followed a pause in donations. A noble might pledge support and then change their mind. A merchant might withdraw promised funds. The chapter might decide that resources were better spent on repairing a chapel elsewhere. Master masons and the bishop had to adapt, often scaling back work, rearranging priorities, or improvising with local materials. Sometimes they paused entire sections of the wall for months, waiting for the next influx of money. Patience was not just a virtue, it was the only option. Generational continuity by this point. The work stretched across decades. A boy who began as an apprentice might grow into a master, teaching the next generation. Old masons passed their knowledge to younger ones. Townsfolk remembered when the first stone was set, and their grandchildren would walk in the shadow of walls started before they were born. Generational continuity became an intrinsic part of cathedral construction. The wall was not merely stone and mortar, it was a slow chronicle of human lives. Each course carried the memory of those who shaped it, those who watched it, and those who funded it. Seasonal interruptions, seasons continued to dictate pace. Winter froze mortar. Spring rain turned the yard into mud. Summer heat dried mortar too fast, while autumn winds threatened scaffolding. Master masons timed work according to the weather. Some tasks, like carving smaller blocks, could continue indoors. Others, lifting heavy stones, setting arches, required dry, calm conditions. The wall rose not on human schedules, but on nature's timetable. The masons adapted, the town waited, and the wall grew inch by inch, season by season. Feast days and holy observances, church holidays also slowed construction. Every saint's day, every vigil, every feast interrupted work. Townsfolk attended processions. Masons prayed or rested. Apprentices sneaked small treats. Even small events, like a local miracle or a visiting relic, could pause construction. The wall simply waited, unmoved by human celebration or curiosity. These interruptions contributed to the cathedral's character, slow, deliberate, and profoundly patient. Minor accidents, small mishaps continued to shape daily life. Ropes frayed, buckets tipped, stones slipped, apprentices tripped. Occasionally, scaffolding creaked ominously, forcing a temporary halt. Yet these events were mostly minor. They created rhythm, caution, and occasionally humor. Observers whispered, laughed quietly, shook their heads. The masons adapted, and the wall continued its patient ascent. Even accidents, when seen from a distance, became part of the wall's story, a slow, meandering narrative that spanned years. The masons pride despite delays and accidents. The masons felt quiet pride, a stone placed correctly, a decorative feature completed, an arch held perfectly. Small victories were celebrated silently, a nod, a slight smile, a quiet sip of ale at day's end. The work was never glamorous, never fast, but each placement carried meaning, skill, and endurance. Each block was a testament to human patience, humility, and diligence. Pilgrims and pilgrims continued to arrive. Some came from distant towns, seeking to witness or touch the slow construction. Nobles visited periodically, inspecting progress or making donations. The presence of outsiders reminded the masons and townsfolk that this wall was part of something larger. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of faith, endurance, and human endeavor. And so the rhythm continued: lift, set, chisel, tap, step back, squint, adjust. Stone by stone, year by year. Reflection, the slow cathedral, lapped the end of each day. The wall seemed little changed. Yet in reality, it was the culmination of decades of effort, observation, and patience. Master masons walked along the lower courses, checking alignment. Apprentices carried tools back to workshops, exhausted but learning. Townsfolk passed by, gossiping quietly. Pilgrims knelt at partially completed arches, offering prayers. The wall bore witness to it all. It was indifferent to complaints, accidents, or the passage of time. It existed on its own rhythm, slow, deliberate, eternal, and through it all, the builders, observers, and visitors learned a quiet truth. Some of the most profound accomplishments in life are measured not in months or years, but in patience, persistence, and the slow accumulation of small, steady actions, decorative stonework. As the wall rose, attention gradually shifted from mere structure to ornamentation. Each stone could carry subtle carvings, tiny flowers, geometric patterns, symbolic motifs. Masters sometimes experimented with intricate details, while apprentices copied carefully, learning the craft. Decorative work was slow. A single flourish could take hours. Mistakes could ruin a block, requiring it to be Yet these details mattered. They were the difference between a plain, functional wall and a cathedral that inspired awe. Even small patterns were scrutinized by the bishop and chapter. A fleur-de-lis slightly off-center could provoke quiet complaints. A misaligned angel in the carvings could elicit a mild reprimand. And so every decorative stone became a lesson in patience, precision, and humility. Mason rivalries and subtle competitions by now. Rivalries among masons had intensified. Masters competed quietly, showing off superior skill in carving or stone placement. Apprentices whispered comparisons, whose chisel marks were smoother, whose arches were straighter. Occasionally, subtle sabotage occurred. A misplaced mortar line or a slightly chipped stone, enough to annoy, but never catastrophic. These rivalries, though minor, influenced the wall itself. Some sections were meticulously precise, others slightly irregular. The wall, patient and indifferent, absorbed all of it, becoming a record of human pride and rivalry, etched in stone. Fundraising anecdotes. Cathedrals' slow progress often depended on unpredictable funds. Nobles promised donations, but delayed them, sometimes for decades. Merchants gave small sums or goods in exchange for public recognition. Pilgrims contributed coins, relics, or small gifts. Occasionally, a wealthy visitor would demand a special carving in exchange for funds. A small angel here, a saint there. Fundraising became a constant negotiation. The bishop walked a delicate line. Too strict and donors withdrew. Too flexible and the cathedral's integrity suffered. The wall's pace reflected these human negotiations. Sections could remain incomplete for months, while money was gathered or disputes resolved. Pilgrims and observers' pilgrims remained, a steady presence. Some came to see progress, others to pray at partially completed arches. Occasionally, curious visitors attempted to help with minor tasks, hauling stones or sweeping dust, much to the annoyance of apprentices. Even so, pilgrims brought life and rhythm to the site. Their curiosity reminded the builders that this wall was not just a project. It was a sacred space, a monument of endurance meant to inspire reverence. Seasonal rituals. The rhythm of construction was intimately tied to seasonal cycles. Spring, careful planning to avoid spring floods. Mud and rain-soaked scaffolds. Summer, long, exhausting days of lifting, setting, and shaping stones, tempered by heat and sunburn. Autumn, winds requiring extra scaffolding bracing and extra caution with pulleys. Winter, indoor carving, tool maintenance, and quiet reflection by the masters. Seasonal awareness was essential. A miscalculation in timing could ruin stonework, endanger workers, or delay the wall by weeks. The builders adapted, learning to align human effort with nature's slow, relentless rhythms. Apprentices and daily learning apprentices continued their painstaking education. They observed, copied, and practiced. They carried stones, mixed mortar, and swept dust. Slowly, they learned weight distribution, masonry angles, pulley mechanics, and delicate carving techniques. Mistakes were tolerated within limits. They were part of the learning process. Generational knowledge accumulated. A master's precision, an apprentice's patience, a boy's clumsy hands, all contributed to the wall. Over decades, the work became a shared human effort, spanning generations and skill levels. Town life around the wall life in the town persisted, with the wall as a constant backdrop. Markets bustled, children played in its shadow, and townsfolk gossiped about progress or lack thereof. Festivals brought temporary pauses, adding moments of cheer or distraction. Nobles visited to check status, sometimes requesting ornate details, sometimes complaining about minor delays. Every action of the town intersected with the wall's slow ascent. Each day's work, each pause, each minor mishap became part of a continuous, centuries-long rhythm. Small accidents and quiet comedy minor accidents continued to punctuate the workday. Buckets tipped, pulleys jammed, stones slipped. Apprentices tripped over ropes. Chickens wandered near scaffolding. Everyone adapted. There was humor in these mishaps, subtle and dry. The masons exchanged wry glances. Apprentices whispered jokes. Townsfolk murmured commentary. Even the bishop might allow himself a private chuckle at some minor misstep. Though he would never admit it aloud, the wall remained patient through all of it, growing slowly, inexorably. Imperceptibly, reflection. The rhythm of construction part of the cathedral story is its patient, deliberate pace, mistakes, rivalries, delays, seasonal interruptions, and minor accidents all contributed to a slow rhythm. Success came in incremental steps. A stone set correctly, a chisel mark smooth, scaffolding holding firm through the wind. These small moments reinforced the builder's endurance, patience, and humility. Over decades, they accumulated into progress. A cathedral wall that was both functional and beautiful, shaped by generations of human effort and the inexorable passage of time. The wall as a living chronicle. Ultimately, the wall was more than stone. It was a record of labor, patience, skill, and human relationships. It witnessed seasonal cycles, minor scandals, rivalries, successes, failures, and generations passing through the town. Every course, every carved detail, every imperfect stone contributed to a quiet chronicle of human life. Builders, observers, pilgrims, and townsfolk all played a part. The wall simply continued, steady, patient, indifferent to the petty dramas of the world around it. It stood as a testament to slow, deliberate human effort, a perfect story for a quiet, reflective mind ready to drift into sleep. Generational labor apprentices who began as boys often matured into masters without seeing the wall finished. Fathers taught sons, brothers learned from each other, and every generation carried forward lessons, rituals, and small superstitions. The wall became a multi-generational labor of love and endurance. Each stone told a story, each arch marked decades of patient work, and each scaffolding plank bore the imprint of countless hands. No individual could hope to complete the project alone. Instead, the cathedral demanded collective patience, a slow accumulation of efforts spanning lifetimes. Long delays were constant. Weather interrupted work. Rain turned scaffolding slippery, snow froze mortar, and wind threatened to topple partially completed arches. Funds ran out unpredictably. Nobles delayed donations. Merchants withdrew promised goods. Even well-intentioned townsfolk sometimes withheld contributions when famine or poor harvests hit, when delays occurred. Work often paused entirely. Apprentices practiced carving indoors. Masters debated adjustments, and the wall waited. Months could pass with no visible progress, but the rhythm persisted, subtle and steady. Social interactions, life around the wall was more than labor. Masons, apprentices, townsfolk, pilgrims, and visiting nobles interacted constantly. Gossip spread quickly. Rivalries simmered, mostly harmless but persistent. Stories circulated of clever tricks, minor accidents, or unusual carvings. Apprentices whispered about which master had the most precise chisel. Townsfolk debated who donated the most, or whose family coat of arms would be most prominently displayed. Nobles occasionally argued over positioning of sculptures or the height of arches. Through all of this, the wall remained patient, absorbing human drama silently, and continuing its slow rise. Accidents and mishaps, small accidents, were routine. Pulley ropes frayed, buckets tipped, stones shifted slightly out of place. Apprentices tripped, tools fell, and scaffolding creaked ominously. Even minor incidents became stories. Remember the time the apprentice dropped the stone and nearly flattened the dog? They were repeated in whispers or quiet chuckles, contributing to the communal rhythm without ever stopping progress entirely. The wall tolerated it all. Indifferent, patient, immovable. Pilgrims and curious visitors' pilgrims continued to arrive, intrigued by progress. Some came to pray at partially completed arches. Others sought souvenirs, small stones, carved fragments, or sketches of the emerging wall. Occasionally, a noble visited, inspecting progress or commissioning a carving. Visitors reminded the town and builders that this wall existed beyond local concerns. Its slow rise was witnessed by countless eyes, reinforcing its role as a shared, communal project. Even the smallest interaction, an apprentice explaining a carving to a curious child, a pilgrim asking why a stone was cut at an unusual angle, added to the wall's ongoing narrative. Seasonal challenges, seasons dictated work more than any schedule could. Spring, mud, rain, and soggy mortars slowed progress. Summer, relentless sun and heat tested endurance. Autumn, winds threatened scaffolding, requiring caution. Winter, frozen ground and halted mortar made indoor carving the only option. The wall moved on nature's timetable, not humanity's. Builders adapted. They measured and planned according to weather, adjusting the rhythm of labor in ways subtle and deliberate. Meals, rest, and routine food provided not only sustenance but also rhythm. Simple meals of bread, cheese, and occasional meat punctuated the day. Ale quenched thirst and allowed a brief moment of camaraderie. Apprentices and masters alike used mealtime to exchange gossip, complaints, or minor observations about work and visitors. Rest periods were necessary. Lifting stones, balancing on scaffolding, and chiseling demanded energy and precision. Exhausted workers returned to tools with renewed patience, continuing the incremental progress that defined cathedral labor. Emotional weight, long-term. Construction exerted a subtle emotional toll. Years of labor, minor frustrations, constant weather interruptions, An endless repetition shaped the psyche. Pride mingled with fatigue. Minor victories balanced by persistent challenges. Mistakes were humbling, progress slow, and recognition delayed. Yet these conditions fostered resilience. Apprentices learned humility, masters gained patience, and the community as a whole understood the virtue of slow, deliberate effort. Reflections on time in the shadow of the wall flowed differently. Days, weeks, and years were measured by stone placement, weather cycles, feast days, and generational transitions. The slow accumulation of work became a measure of human persistence, teaching lessons in patience, humility, and endurance. The wall did not hurry. It tolerated human error, social complexity, and seasonal unpredictability. Its quiet, measured growth demonstrated that even the grandest achievements can emerge only through steady, persistent effort. Master Mason rivalries by this stage. Rivalries among Master Masons had become a almost ritualized aspect of life around the wall. Masters subtly competed to demonstrate skill. One might carve a decorative motif with extra precision. Another might insist their stone alignment was the straightest. Apprentices whispered comparisons, and townsfolk occasionally joined the debate, remarking on whose chisel marks were smoother or whose arches appeared more balanced. Sometimes, a rivalry manifested in minor sabotage. A slightly chipped stone, a misaligned course, or a frayed rope was enough to annoy a colleague, but rarely enough to endanger the wall. Masters adapted, correcting minor mistakes while silently acknowledging the quiet competitions that defined their daily rhythm. The result was a wall that reflected centuries of human personality. Pride, competitiveness, and stubbornness etched subtly into stone. Imperceptible to most observers, but tangible to those who lived among it. Mishaps apprentices, of course, were the frequent source of minor chaos. Buckets of mortar spilled. Stones slipped from scaffolds. Pulley ropes frayed under inexperienced hands. Apprentices tripped over tools or misjudged weight, sending small rocks tumbling into dust. Masters scolded quietly, sometimes with a dry comment, "At least you didn't drop the angel this time." Apprentices learned, adapted, and occasionally repeated the mistake weeks later. It was all part of the slow, patient rhythm of learning. These mishaps created subtle humor, a gentle undercurrent of amusement that persisted alongside the otherwise monotonous work. Townsfolk might gossip about the apprentice who dropped a stone for the third time that week, and the story would circulate quietly, adding personality to the wall's narrative. Seasonal, festivals and public interruptions. The town's festivals continued to punctuate the wall's construction. Holy days, saints' feasts, and local celebrations brought temporary pauses. Masons often attended reluctantly. Apprentices sometimes snuck treats or watched performances in secret. Markets thrived with visitors, pilgrims arrived, and nobles occasionally made appearances. Even the simplest celebrations, like a traveling minstrel performing near scaffolding or a procession of townsfolk carrying candles, interrupted work slightly, but provided subtle rhythm. The wall remained indifferent, patiently waiting for humans to resume their duties, stone by stone. Nobles' interventions, nobles visiting the construction site occasionally influenced progress, sometimes slowing work with requests for special carvings or adjustments. One might request a saint's figure larger, a window taller, or a crest more prominently displayed. Masters would negotiate, sometimes reluctantly, accommodating the noble's wishes while maintaining structural integrity. These interventions added complexity and humor. Apprentices might whisper, "Watch the noble's shadow. He'll demand a new angel in the middle of the arch." Masters would roll their eyes discreetly, but quietly appreciate the small challenge of balancing. Artistry with authority, even delays from nobles, became part of the wall's rhythm, a testament to the interplay between human desires and architectural patience, daily life, and small triumphs life. At the wall was slow but punctuated by tiny victories. A pulley system worked perfectly for an entire day. A stone settled exactly where intended. Mortar hardened without cracks. Decorative motifs aligned with precision. These small triumphs were celebrated quietly. A nod between masons, a whispered compliment to an apprentice, a small acknowledgement from a visiting noble. Over decades, these incremental successes accumulated into measurable progress. The wall rose slowly, each achievement a step toward eventual completion. However imperceptible it seemed to those outside the construction crew, pilgrims and curious observers. Pilgrims remained a constant presence. Some arrived to touch stone or pray near the scaffolds. Others were simply curious, sketching arches or observing masons at work. Occasionally, visitors attempted minor tasks, which usually resulted in mild chaos and private amusement for the workers. Their presence reminded everyone that the wall existed beyond the town, a monument witnessed by countless eyes, a slow testament to faith, skill, and patience. Even the smallest interaction, a question from a pilgrim, a brief explanation from an apprentice, added to the cathedral's layered story. Emotional rhythm and reflection. The emotional rhythm of life around the wall was subtle but pervasive. Years of labor, repeated mistakes, long pauses, and minor rivalries shaped the psyche of everyone involved. Pride, frustration, patience, and humility coexisted in quiet cycles. Masons learned to celebrate small victories, to endure setbacks, and to appreciate the cumulative nature of their labor. Apprentices absorbed lessons not only in masonry but in human persistence. Townsfolk and pilgrims observed, participated, and contributed to the rhythm of life surrounding the wall. The wall became a silent teacher. It demanded patience, encouraged reflection, and tolerated error while slowly, imperceptibly, rising toward completion. Whether tools and the passage of time moved differently near the cathedral wall. Rain, snow, sun, and wind dictated work more than any human schedule. Tools required constant maintenance. Scaffolding had to be checked daily. Pulleys needed greasing. Mortar mixers were tested repeatedly for consistency. Every task, however small, contributed to the slow, deliberate progress of the wall. Generations of masons, apprentices, and townsfolk interacted with these elements, shaping a rhythm that spanned decades, even centuries. It was a quiet meditation on patience and endurance, a demonstration of how grand human endeavors unfold not in dramatic bursts, but in persistent, measured effort. The long view by this stage, the cathedral wall had risen noticeably, though not dramatically. To casual observers, progress might still appear imperceptible. But for those who had lived with it, every course of stone, every scaffolding plank, and every carved detail told a story of decades. Masons who began as young apprentices were now middle-aged masters. Their hands were calloused, their backs bent from years of lifting and chiseling, their eyes attuned to the subtle nuances of stone. Apprentices had grown, and new generations had arrived, learning the same lessons in patience, precision, and humility. The wall, indifferent to the passage of human life, absorbed it all: mistakes, rivalries, celebrations, and pauses. It remained patient, a silent chronicle of collective human effort. Daily rhythm days continued with the same slow, meditative rhythm. Workers arrived before sunrise. Tools were inspected, pulleys greased, scaffolding checked. Stones were lifted carefully, set precisely, and adjusted repeatedly until the line of the wall was true. Mortar was mixed with care, applied patiently, and left to settle. Lunches and short rests punctuated the work. Bread, cheese, and occasionally meat were shared quietly, often with hushed conversation. Apprentices whispered, masters nodded, townsfolk watched. Each moment of daily life contributed to the subtle, enduring rhythm of the site. Seasonal cycles, seasons, dictated work more than human schedules. Spring, muddy grounds, slowed movement. Rain softened mortar unpredictably. Summer heat was relentless, drying mortar too quickly and making scaffolding exhausting. Autumn, winds threatened balance, requiring extra bracing. Winter, frozen ground and halted mortar limited work, forcing indoor carving and planning. Builders adapted to these cycles, learning to synchronize human effort with nature's slow, relentless rhythms. The wall grew at its own pace, shaped by both human hands and environmental forces. Decorative milestones as the wall grew. Decorative details became more prominent. Carvings of angels, saints, and geometric patterns emerged. Masters demonstrated skill and creativity, while apprentices copied diligently, learning the subtleties of design, proportion, and balance. Even small adjustments required care. A misplaced angel or misaligned pattern could demand hours of recutting or repositioning. These tasks, though minor, reinforced patience and precision, teaching builders that beauty in architecture is achieved not in haste, but in measured, thoughtful effort. Town and community life in the town continued, weaving around the wall's slow ascent. Markets bustled with merchants and shoppers. Children played in shadows, chasing each other across uneven streets. Festivals and holy days brought temporary interruptions, with music, dancing, and feasting. Pilgrims arrived to pray or observe. Nobles inspected progress, sometimes requesting special carvings or adjustments. The wall remained indifferent, silently witnessing the rhythms, celebrations, and minor dramas of everyday life. It became a constant in a world of fleeting moments, a slow, enduring pulse against the transience of human activity. Master, masons, and apprentices, generational continuity shaped the workforce. Masters guided apprentices, teaching not only techniques but subtle lessons in patience, observation, and problems. Apprentices learned through repetition, observing mistakes, and practicing endlessly. Some would advance to journeymen and, eventually, masters themselves. This long-term learning ensured that knowledge was preserved, passed from one generation to the next, even as the wall continued its slow ascent. Human life cycled around it, but the wall remained steadfast, patient, and unhurried. Pilgrims and pilgrims remained a steady presence. Some arrived to pray near the wall or touch the slowly rising stones. Others observed masons at work, sketched details, or whispered prayers. Occasional visitors attempted minor tasks, usually resulting in mild chaos and gentle humor. Their presence reminded the town and builders that the cathedral wall was more than a construction project. It was a symbol, a monument, and a shared human endeavor, witnessed by countless eyes over decades. Minor mishaps and gentle humor accidents continued, though they were usually minor. Buckets tipped, pulley ropes frayed, stones slipped slightly out of place, apprentices tripped over tools, a chicken wandered too close to scaffolding. These small incidents created subtle humor, a gentle undercurrent of amusement in otherwise monotonous work. Masters exchanged knowing glances, apprentices whispered jokes, townsfolk murmured commentary. The wall absorbed it all, unmoved and patient. Reflections on patience. The wall's slow ascent was a quiet meditation on human persistence. Mistakes, delays, rivalries, and interruptions all contributed to a rhythm that stretched across decades. Small victories, a perfectly placed stone, a smooth carving, scaffolding holding firm, accumulated over time into tangible progress. Builders learned to endure setbacks, to celebrate minor triumphs, and to appreciate the cumulative nature of their work. The wall demonstrated that the grandest achievements often emerge not in bursts of excitement, but in measured, persistent effort sustained over years and generations. Generational continuity apprentices who started as children are now fully trained masons. Masters have aged, their hands gnarled from years of chiseling, lifting, and adjusting. Some have retired, passing their knowledge to a new generation, while others continue, stubbornly insisting on supervising every detail. The wall has become a living archive of human life. Every stone, every mortar line, and every subtle curve carries the mark of countless individuals. Generational continuity ensures that lessons learned in youth are preserved and refined over decades, quietly shaping the cathedral's slow ascent. Seasonal, cycles and work adaptations. Seasons dictate the pace of construction more than human ambition. Spring brings rain, mud, and unpredictability. Mortar takes longer to set. Scaffolding becomes slippery, and workers adjust carefully. Summer offers long daylight, but heat dries mortar too quickly and exhausts laborers. Autumn introduces wind and cooler temperatures, requiring extra bracing and caution. Winter freezes the ground and halts outdoor work, shifting labor indoors to carving and tool maintenance. Builders have learned to synchronize human effort with nature's rhythm. Each stone is set not only with skill, but with awareness of timing, weather, and environmental conditions. The wall grows patiently, following its own schedule. Decorative achievements, decorative work takes on greater prominence as the wall rises. Carvings of angels, saints, geometric patterns, and symbolic motifs adorn the surface. Masters experiment with intricate designs, while apprentices diligently copy them, learning proportion, symmetry, and subtle aesthetic judgment. Even minor mistakes require recutting or adjustment, teaching builders humility. Over decades, the cumulative decorative work transforms the wall from functional structure to a visual narrative of craftsmanship, patience, and devotion. Town life in the shadow of the wall. The town has grown accustomed to life. Alongside the slow-rising wall, markets bustle near scaffolding. Children play in shadowed corners. Pilgrims visit to pray or observe construction. Festivals and holy days bring temporary interruptions with music, dancing, and feasting. Nobles occasionally intervene, requesting minor adjustments or elaborate carvings. The wall remains indifferent to these social rhythms. silently observing human activity while continuing its deliberate, measured ascent. Master masons and apprentices, generational apprenticeship continues to shape the workforce. Masters guide apprentices, teaching both technical skills and subtle life lessons, patience, observation, resilience, and humility. Apprentices learn through repetition, errors, and careful observation. Some eventually become journeymen and, later, masters themselves. This ongoing cycle of learning ensures that knowledge and technique are preserved across generations, allowing the cathedral wall to progress slowly but steadily. Pilgrims and curious visitors. Pilgrims remain a constant presence. Some come to touch the stones, pray near arches, or witness progress. Others observe the masons at work, sketching or quietly commenting on progress. Occasionally, curious visitors attempt minor tasks, causing gentle chaos and quiet amusement. Their presence reinforces the cathedral's role as a symbol of shared human endeavor. Witness to decades of labor, skill, and patience. Even the smallest interaction or question from a pilgrim, a whispered explanation from an apprentice adds to the wall's layered story. Minor mishaps and gentle humor accidents continue, though rarely severe. Buckets tip, pulley ropes fray, stones shift slightly, apprentices stumble, and animals occasionally wander too close to scaffolding. These small incidents provide subtle humor, a gentle undercurrent of amusement. Masters exchange wry glances. Apprentices whisper jokes. Townsfolk murmur commentary. The wall remains patient, indifferent to human mishaps, quietly absorbing the ebb and flow of life around it. Emotional weight and reflection. Decades of construction impose a subtle, emotional rhythm on all involved. Pride, fatigue, humility, and patience coexist. Small successes of precisely placed stone, a smooth carving, scaffolding holding firm are celebrated quietly. Mistakes and delays teach endurance. Rivalries among masters and apprentices provide gentle tension. The wall itself embodies patience. Its slow rise demonstrates that progress is cumulative, often imperceptible, and that meaningful achievements require persistent, measured effort. Time measured in stone near the wall. Time moves differently. Days are counted by mortar setting, scaffolding assembly, and stone placement. Years are measured by apprentices' growth, masters' aging, and incremental progress. Generations pass, yet the wall remains constanta, patient observer, silent witness, and enduring monument to human effort. The cumulative work of countless hands, eyes, and minds manifests in stone. The wall grows, not through haste or drama, but through quiet, persistent effort spanning decades, even centuries. The wall nears its form. The cathedral wall has risen significantly. Though perfection remained elusive, years of labor are visible in every stone. Some courses are slightly irregular, a subtle testament to human error. Others align with perfect precision, evidence of generations of mastered craft. The wall embodies both imperfection and accomplishment, quietly teaching patience and perseverance. Apprentices who began as children are now fully trained masons, some taking pride in completing stones their forebears started decades earlier. Masters, aging and reflective, inspect lines of mortar with satisfaction tinged by exhaustion and humility. The wall, indifferent yet enduring, quietly witnesses this accumulation of decades, absorbing human triumph, error, and persistence. Decorative flourishes and final details. Decorative work reaches its subtle crescendo. Angels, saints, floral patterns, geometric designs, and intricate carvings emerge with greater precision. Masters experiment with minute details. Apprentices perfect replication. Even slight misalignments require attention. A crooked angel, a misaligned arch, or an imperfect window frame might demand careful adjustment. These tiny acts, repeated over decades, produce a wall rich in subtle artistry, demonstrating that beauty arises from cumulative effort rather than rapid construction. Generational reflection. Generations of workers, apprentices, and masters contemplate the slow journey. Elder masons reflect on decades of labor, remembering mistakes, rivalries, and minor accidents. Apprentices turned journeymen take quiet pride in accomplishments, knowing their hands contributed to a centuries-long project. New apprentices observe and absorb lessons, ready to continue the work if future expansions arise. The wall is a silent archive, holding memory, labor, and human experience within its stones. Each course represents a year, a decade, or even a lifetime, patiently waiting for visitors, pilgrims, and future generations to appreciate its story. Community interactions. Life around the wall continues with gentle rhythm. Markets operate nearby. Children play in shadows. Pilgrims visit to touch stones or pray. Nobles occasionally request minor adjustments or adornments, prompting subtle negotiations among masons. Festivals punctuate seasons with feasts, music, and brief pauses in labor. All interactions, interruptions, and social dynamics are absorbed by the wall. It remains patient, indifferent to gossip, humor, or minor accidents, quietly chronicling decades of human life. Subtle humor and minor mishaps. Even near completion, gentle chaos persists. Buckets tip, ropes fray, apprentices stumble, chickens wander under scaffolding. Minor incidents produce subtle humor. Masters exchange wry glances. Apprentices whisper jokes. Townsfolk murmur commentary. The wall absorbs all of it, unmoved, steadily progressing. These moments, though trivial, add depth to the cathedral's long, patient story, giving life to its stones beyond mere architecture. Seasonal reflection. Seasons continue to govern labor. Even at this late stage, spring, muddy grounds, and rain test patience. Summer, heat, dries mortar quickly, demanding precise timing. Autumn, wind necessitates bracing and careful attention to scaffolding. Winter, frozen ground holds outdoor work, shifting labor indoors to carving, polishing, and planning. The rhythm of construction remains synchronized with nature. Human effort flows in harmony with seasonal cycles, reinforcing the slow, deliberate character of the cathedral's creation. Emotional weight and enduring. Lessons. Decades of labor leave subtle emotional imprints. Pride, humility, endurance, and patience coexist. Small victories, perfectly placed stones, smooth carvings, scaffolding holding firm, are celebrated quietly. Minor rivalries, social dynamics, and unexpected interruptions provide gentle tension. Mistakes and delays teach resilience. The wall embodies patience. Its slow, imperceptible ascent demonstrates that meaningful achievement requires measured, persistent effort over time, rather than bursts of energy or hurried progress. The wall as a legacy. The cathedral wall is more than stone. It is a chronicle of generations, apprentices, masters, townsfolk, pilgrims, and nobles all contributed in small, deliberate ways. Each stone reflects labor, observation, and collective human effort. Each course embodies decades of skill, patience, and endurance. The wall teaches subtle lessons in humility, persistence, and the quiet accumulation of effort. It is both a physical structure and a symbol of human patience, absorbing errors, triumphs, and life itself with serene indifference, quiet contemplation as construction slows. Reflection becomes central. Workers pause to observe completed sections, noting alignment, decoration, and structural integrity. Apprentices marvel at stones their forebears set decades earlier. Masters consider the years of labor, the generations of learning, and the cumulative effort embedded in every curve and corner. Visitors, pilgrims, and townsfolk experience the same quiet wonder. The wall conveys both human achievement and impermanence. It teaches that even the grandest endeavors unfold over time, requiring patience, endurance, and the gentle acceptance of imperfection.